Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. The Battle of Vetchfield Farm. In the 132nd year of the Common Reckoning, Odo Eartoft led an army of halflings across the Skelding frontier, driving the Skelding settlers from the land in disarray. Odo marched into Elmgrove and then onward, pursuing the Skeldings as they fled toward Great Hall. A Skelding lord named Eldred determined to resist the halfling invaders, and rallied some of the stouter-hearted Skeldings to him. The core of his army was some 150 spearmen under Eldred's direct command. About 50 of these were armoured warriors from the retinues of local lords. The remainder were unarmoured levy spearmen. There was a small force of armoured cavalry, less than 100 of them, formed of various minor nobles and their senior retainers. Eldred placed these horsemen under the command of his younger brother, Oswin. The remainder of the army, nearly 400 men, was made up of unarmoured infantry. Some of these were archers, or equipped as light infantry, carrying slings or javelins and shields. But the majority were peasants, armed only with farm tools. The halfling force numbered about 700. Approximately half of these were missile troops, carrying bows or slings, many of whom had fought alongside Odo at the hill hold. The remainder were armed with spears and carrying shields. Odo had divided his army into 4 groups, each consisting of a mixture of troop types for mutual support. These groups were spread out in line, advancing across a broad front, sweeping the countryside for any Skelding stragglers. On the morning of the battle, this halfling formation was approaching a rather nondescript farmhouse, next to which was a somewhat small and unremarkable barn. Beyond the farmhouse were a couple of fields and a scatter of unromantic outbuildings. Together, these prosaic structures comprised a Vetchfield farm. The Skelding inhabitants had fled, and the place was deserted. But beyond the fields, the halfling's sharp eyes observed Eldred's host forming up for battle. Eldred also formed his troops into a line, with him and his spearmen in the centre. On his far left he placed the cavalry. Between the cavalry and the spearmen was a force of mixed infantry, with 2 more such groups of infantry out on his right flank. Eldred ordered a general advance. The 2 groups of infantry on his right rushed forward, passing between the fields and an adjacent wood, merging together as they did so. In the centre, the spearmen pushed up to the walls of the fields, supported by the group of mixed infantry immediately to their left. Out on Eldred's far left, Oswin and the cavalry cautiously advanced. The halflings also moved forward. The 2 groups in the centre moved up to the farmhouse, one on each side. The group on Odo's far left also pushed forward, opposing the advancing Skelding massed mixed infantry. But the group of halflings on Odo's right observed the Skelding horsemen confronting them and hung back. The first casualties of the battle occurred on Eldred's right, where Skelding archers and slingers among his infantry loosed arrows and hurled slingshot at the halflings in front of them. The remainder of the Skelding infantry charged forward, seeking to bring the halflings to blows. The halflings responded by loosing arrows and slingshot of their own back at the Skeldings. A line of spear halflings then advanced through the halfling archers and slingers and formed a shield wall, intending to protect the missile troops from the Skelding onslaught. In the centre, the Skelding spearmen laboriously climbed over the field wall. As they did, the halflings by the farmhouse attacked them with bow and sling, somewhat reducing the Skeldings' numbers. Eldred ordered the infantry on his left to charge across the field and put an end to these attacks. Odo's group of halflings was positioned with the farmhouse on their left. They lined the field wall and prepared to meet the Skelding charge. Meanwhile, the group of halflings on the other side of the farmhouse advanced, between the farmhouse and the barn, into the open fields. Beyond the fields, out on the far left of the halfling line, the screening halfling shield wall braced itself to meet the Skelding charge. The halflings were desperately outnumbered, but they stood firm against the initial assault, which faltered. The halflings slowly withdrew, falling back on the missile troops behind them, and both sides paused for breath. In the centre, Eldred and his spearmen advanced across the fields they had previously climbed into, and lined the wall on its far side, beyond which was another field. At the far side of that field was the farmhouse, but, more pressingly for Eldred, in the centre of this field stood the halflings who had just advanced between the farmhouse and the barn. On Eldred's immediate right, his charging infantry were greeted with a barrage of missiles loosed by Odo's band of halflings. The Skelding ranks were thinned, but still the Skeldings came on. And now the halflings in the field attacked, pelting the Skelding spearmen behind the wall with more arrows and slingshot. But the wall provided shelter to the Skeldings, and so this barrage of missiles had little effect. Frustrated by this, the spear halflings in the field then charged the Skelding spearmen, but with their longer spears and protected by the wall, the Skeldings successfully kept them at bay. Frustrated again, most of the spear halflings fell back to rejoin the missile troops behind them. Meanwhile, the group of halflings positioned at the far right of the halfling line had screwed up their courage to the sticking point and advanced toward the Skelding cavalry. The cavalry responded by charging at the halflings. Oswin no doubt reckoned on easily riding down his tiny foes, but he had underestimated them. Halfling archers and slingers took a heavy toll on the charging horsemen, and when the horses reached the halfling line, they were greeted by a hedge of halfling spear points. The surviving horsemen turned and fled, reforming at a safe distance. The charging Skelding infantry had better luck. They crashed into Odo's band of halflings near the farmhouse. Most of these Skeldings were peasants, armed with scythes and other farming implements, and they cut down the first rank of the halflings like corn. The group of halflings on the far left of the halfling line now counterattacked. A hail of arrows and slingshot swept over the Skeldings on that flank, closely followed by charging spear halflings. The Skeldings suffered many casualties, but ultimately weight of Skelding numbers started to tell, and as the fight raged on, the Skeldings gained the upper hand. Eldred's spearmen now attacked. They first slew the foolish spear halflings who had elected to fight on at the wall. They then crossed the wall and advanced menacingly toward the remaining halflings in the field. Halfling missiles bounced harmlessly off Skelding shields and armour, and the remaining spear halflings formed a defensive formation. But it did them little good. The Skelding spearmen were inexorable. On the other side of the farm, Odo rallied those of his wavering halflings who still lived, urging them to strike back against the scythe-wielding Skelding peasants confronting them. His leadership was inspirational. With a great cry, the halflings surged forward, completely overwhelming the Skeldings. At this point, the battle was in the balance. Odo's left flank had been obliterated. In the field behind the farmhouse, his halflings were having the worst of their encounter with the Skelding spearmen. But by the farmhouse and on his right, his halflings had been victorious. Odo ordered the spear halflings on his right to come to his assistance at the farmhouse, leaving the archers behind to hold the surviving Skelding cavalry at bay. And he called the halflings in the field to fall back to the farmhouse, where he could provide them with support. As the halflings thus reformed and reorganised, Oswin, humiliated and angered by his previous inept performance, and seeing the spear halflings confronting him moving away, once again ordered his cavalry to charge. If he was expecting a different outcome, he was sadly mistaken. The spear halflings reversed their motion and charged him in the flank. Oswin himself was killed, his force was massacred, and the few survivors fled the field. And in the centre, Odo ordered his archers and slingers to once more target the Skelding spearmen. This attack was not devastating, killing or wounding only a small number of spearmen, but it did drive some others back. The halflings then loosed yet another volley of halfling missiles at the milling and disorganised Skelding ranks. Again, this attack did not cause a great number of casualties among the Skeldings, but it did have a significant impact. For one of those casualties was Eldred. And with the death of Eldred, the Skelding spearmen broke and ran. On the Skelding right, the victorious Skelding peasants and light infantry were finishing off the last halflings that still confronted them. But even as they exulted in their triumph, they saw the Skelding spearmen, the backbone of the Skelding force, taking flight, and their exuberance turned to panic. They followed the spearmen and routed from the field. Thus did Odo win a famous victory, and thus ended the Battle of Vetchfield Farm.